While my 26-year-old life was being systematically destroyed by false theft accusations from my own family, my 29-year-old golden child sister Gemma was sitting in our living room watching my parents, John and Lisa, tear me apart over her missing $8,000 engagement ring, knowing damn well she'd probably lost it herself, but letting them exile me from the family home that same night, because protecting her perfect reputation was worth sacrificing her brother's entire relationship with everyone he'd ever loved. Not a police investigation or house search. A 6-hour family trial where I wasn't allowed to defend myself while they used my job struggles as evidence I was desperate enough to steal from my own sister, ending with a 24-hour ultimatum to return jewelry I'd never seen or never come back. At 26 years old, I'd been working minimum wage jobs and struggling to find direction while living at home, watching my parents worship every breath Gemma took as their successful marketing executive daughter, never once receiving the kind of unconditional support they'd given her since childhood, when she'd failed at multiple careers before finding success. But the moment something went wrong in her perfect life, they instantly decided their disappointment son must be the criminal who destroyed her engagement celebration. 3 years of sleeping in motels, working double shifts to afford a studio apartment, spending every holiday alone, and explaining to new friends why I had no family contact, all while they celebrated Gemma's wedding and promotions without the brother they'd thrown away like garbage. Here's what made their betrayal absolutely insane. They were so confident in their character assassination that they never bothered searching their own house properly until a kitchen renovation 3 years later forced them to replace their garbage disposal and discovered Gemma's precious engagement ring had been stuck in the drain the entire time, proving their golden child had accidentally dropped it while washing dishes and was too embarrassed to admit her mistake. What these guilt-stricken cowards didn't know was that the broken son they'd discarded had spent 3 years learning that DNA doesn't automatically earn respect. And when they came crawling back with their pathetic apologies and desperate attempts to make things right, they'd discover that exile teaches sons to set boundaries that guilty parents can't guilt-trip their way through. By the time I finished documenting exactly what 3 years of false accusations had cost me, and what kind of limited relationship they'd earned through their betrayal, they learned that some sons outgrow the need for family approval, and forgiveness becomes a privilege that has to be earned through genuine accountability, not demanded through crocodile tears and convenient kitchen renovations. To understand how my own parents could destroy my life over a missing piece of jewelry without bothering to investigate you, need to know that Gemma had been the family's designated success story since we were children, while I'd been cast as the disappointment who never quite measured up to their golden daughter's achievements. Every family conversation centered around Gemma's latest promotion, Gemma's new apartment, Gemma's exciting dating life, while my struggles with finding career direction were treated as character flaws rather than normal growing pains. Gemma had failed at 3 different career paths before landing her marketing job, but each failure was treated as a learning experience that would make her stronger. When I struggled with job interviews or got rejected from positions, it was evidence that I lacked ambition and drive. When Gemma changed apartments every year because she couldn't decide what neighborhood she wanted to live in, our parents helped with moving costs and security deposits. When I asked for help with rent while job searching, they suggested I learn to budget better. The double standard was so ingrained in our family dynamic that I'd stopped questioning it years ago. Gemma was the child who deserved investment and support. I was the child who needed to prove he was worth their time and attention. Every family dinner was a performance where I tried to share good news that might earn their approval while they redirected the conversation back to whatever milestone Gemma was celebrating that week. Gemma was the golden child I was. The family disappointment. By 26, I was still living at home and working a series of minimum wage jobs while trying to figure out what career path might finally earn their respect. Every job application felt like an audition for their approval. Every interview rejection was another confirmation that I wasn't living up to the standards they'd set for successful children. I'd watch Gemma breeze through life with their unconditional support, while I fought for scraps of recognition. The worst part wasn't the favoritism itself. It was how desperately I still wanted their validation, despite years of evidence that I'd never be their priority. I kept believing that if I could just find the right job, make the right choices, achieve the right milestones, maybe they'd finally see me as more than the child who disappointed them by not being as naturally gifted as their daughter. I was still trying to prove I belonged in this family. When Gemma announced her engagement to David, a financial advisor she'd been dating for 18 months, our parents acted like she'd won the lottery. The diamond ring was an $8,000 symbol of everything they'd hoped for their daughter: stability, success, and proof that their investment in her happiness had paid off. They immediately began planning an engagement party, calling relatives to share the news, and treating the ring like a family heirloom, even though David had bought it 3 weeks earlier. The engagement became the family's main source of joy and conversation. Every dinner was spent discussing wedding plans, venue options, and guest lists. Gemma would hold up her hand to catch the light on her diamond, while our parents beamed with pride about their daughter's ability to attract such a successful man. The ring represented everything I wasn't: valuable, chosen, celebrated. I should have recognized it as a warning sign when our parents started treating that piece of jewelry like the most important object in our house. But I was too focused on trying to share in their happiness, hoping that celebrating Gemma's engagement might finally give me a way to contribute something positive to the family dynamic. The engagement ring became the center of everything. The crisis that would destroy my relationship with my family began on a Saturday morning when Gemma came downstairs in a panic, claiming her engagement ring had disappeared from her dresser overnight. She'd taken it off before her shower the evening before, placed it in the small jewelry dish on her dresser, like she always did, and woken up to find it missing from the spot where she was absolutely certain she'd left it. Within minutes, the entire household was mobilized in a frantic search operation. My parents transformed into crime scene investigators, methodically checking every surface in Gemma's bedroom, the bathroom and the hallway between. They emptied her purse, searched her car, and even checked the washing machine in case the ring had somehow fallen into dirty laundry. Gemma was inconsolable, crying about how she'd let David down and ruined their engagement by being careless with the most expensive piece of jewelry she'd ever owned. The $8,000 value kept being mentioned, as if the price tag made the loss more tragic than simple sentimental value. Every few minutes, she'd remember another possible location where the ring might be hiding, sending our parents scrambling to check under furniture, inside shoes, and through bathroom drawers. But what struck me as odd was how quickly they gave up searching the kitchen, even though Gemma had helped clean up after dinner the night before. They checked the living room, thoroughly went through every inch of her bedroom twice, but barely glanced at the sink area where she'd washed dishes. The search felt more like panic than systematic investigation. Gemma's engagement ring had disappeared without a trace. The moment that changed everything came when Gemma looked directly at me during our family meeting and said the words that would haunt me for the next 3 years. "Elliot's been acting weird lately, and he knows how much this ring means to me. Maybe he took it to sell it or something since he's been having money problems." Not a question about whether I'd seen the ring. Not a request to help search my room. Not even a hesitant suggestion that maybe I might know something about its location. A direct accusation delivered with the confidence of someone who'd already decided I was guilty and was just waiting for the right moment to voice her suspicions. My parents' reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of defending me or asking for evidence, Dad's face hardened with disappointment, while Mom shook her head like she'd been expecting this moment for years. The speed with which they accepted Gemma's theory told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this family's hierarchy of trust. Without any proof, they decided I was the thief. What followed was the most devastating 6 hours of my life, as my parents called an emergency family meeting in our living room and proceeded to conduct what could only be described as a trial, where my guilt had already been determined before I was allowed to speak. Dad sat in his usual chair, looking like a disappointed judge. Mom positioned herself next to Gemma on the couch, like a supportive attorney, and I was left standing in the middle of the room like a defendant who'd been brought in for sentencing rather than questioning. "We need to talk about what happened to Gemma's ring," Dad began in the tone he'd used when I was 12 and had broken something valuable. "This is a serious situation, and we need honest answers about what you know and what you've done." The presumption of guilt was immediate and absolute, not, "Do you know anything about the missing ring?" or "Can you help us figure out what might have happened?" Just a demand for confession wrapped in the language of investigation. When I tried to explain that I hadn't seen the ring and had no idea where it might be, Mom cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Elliot, we're not stupid," she said, with the kind of patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "You've been acting different lately. You've been stressed about money, and you know exactly how much that ring is worth. Just tell us the truth and we can figure out how to fix this." Gemma sat there, dabbing her eyes with tissues while watching my parents tear me apart, occasionally adding helpful details about how worried she was about my financial situation and how she'd noticed me looking at her ring during family dinners. Every word out of her mouth was designed to build a case against me while maintaining her image as the concerned sister who just wanted her property back. My own family held a trial where I was already guilty. The character assassination that followed was systematic and brutal, as my parents used every struggle I'd shared with them as evidence of criminal desperation. The job rejections I'd confided in them about became proof that I was desperate for money. The credit card debt I'd mentioned during a vulnerable conversation became evidence that I was capable of anything to solve my financial problems. The uncertainty about my career direction that they'd criticized for years suddenly became a motive for theft. "You've been living here rent-free for months," Dad said, as if my financial struggles were a personal insult to him rather than something they'd offered to help with. "You see Gemma working hard and achieving success, and maybe you resented that enough to take something from her." Mom nodded along, like she'd been waiting for this moment for years. "We've watched you struggle with responsibility and decision-making, and maybe the pressure finally got to you. But taking your sister's engagement ring, that crosses a line we never thought you'd cross." The cruelest part wasn't the accusation itself. It was how eagerly they embraced the narrative that their son was a thief rather than considering that their daughter might have simply misplaced her own jewelry. Every personal failure I'd shared with them, every moment of vulnerability where I'd asked for their support, was now being used as ammunition against me. They used my struggles as proof I was a thief. The ultimatum came after 6 hours of interrogation accusations and character assassination that left me emotionally destroyed and completely isolated from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Dad delivered the final verdict with the authority of someone who'd never questioned his own judgment. "You have 24 hours to return Gemma's ring and apologize for what you've done. If that ring doesn't appear by tomorrow night, You're no longer welcome in this house. No police investigation, no actual evidence, no consideration that maybe they should search the house more thoroughly before destroying their son's life. Just an immediate exile based on nothing but their golden child's accusations and their own willingness to believe the worst about me rather than challenge her perfect image. "We're not doing this to be cruel," Mom added, as if banishing me was an act of tough love rather than complete betrayal. "We're giving you a chance to do the right thing and make this right. But if you can't be honest with us about what you've done, then you can't live here anymore." The speed with which they'd gone from missing ring to criminal accusation to threatened homelessness was breathtaking in its cruelty. 24 hours to confess to a crime I hadn't committed or lose my family forever. That was the choice they gave me after 26 years of being their son. They kicked me out and told me never to come back. The first month after being kicked out was a blur of cheap motels' job applications filled out in public libraries, and the crushing realization that my family had chosen to believe I was a criminal rather than search their own house more thoroughly. I spent my days applying for any position that would hire someone with no permanent address, and my nights staring at motel room ceilings wondering how 26 years of being someone's son could disappear in a single evening. Every morning, I woke up expecting a phone call from my parents saying they'd found the ring and realized their mistake. Every evening I went to bed, disappointed that my phone had stayed silent while they continued their lives, without the son they'd decided was a thief. The isolation was devastating, but what hurt more was the growing realization that they weren't even looking for me or wondering if I was okay. The financial reality was brutal. Motels charged by the week eating out was expensive, and finding work without a stable address was nearly impossible. I was burning through my savings while trying to prove I could survive the exile they'd imposed. But every dollar I spent was another day further from the security I'd lost when they'd chosen Gemma's accusations over their son's innocence. I learned to survive without the family that abandoned me. Gradually, something shifted from survival to determination. I found a job at a warehouse that paid enough to afford a studio apartment in the next town over, 40 minutes away from the family who'd thrown me away, but close enough that I could rebuild my life without starting completely over. The apartment was tiny and unfurnished, but it was mine, in a way that my childhood bedroom had never been. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions without worrying about my parents' approval or Gemma's judgment. I bought furniture from thrift stores, cooked meals that I actually wanted to eat, and discovered that I was capable of far more independence than anyone in my family had ever given me credit for. The job led to a promotion, which led to a better apartment, which led to friendships with coworkers who knew me as someone reliable and hardworking rather than the family disappointment. 6 months after my exile, I realized I was happier than I'd been in years. Not because I'd wanted to leave my family, but because living without their constant criticism and comparison had allowed me to discover who I was when I wasn't desperately trying to earn their approval. The anxiety that had defined my relationship with them was replaced by a sense of accomplishment that came from building something entirely my own. I built a life they never thought I could achieve. By the 1-year mark, I'd made a decision that would define the next phase of my independence, complete no contact with the family that had destroyed my life over false accusations. I changed my phone number, blocked them on social media, and moved to a different apartment in case they tried to find me. Their choice to exile me had become my choice to stay away from people who'd proven they'd sacrifice me to protect their golden child. The friends I'd made knew me as someone who was building his own life rather than someone whose family had rejected him. I'd learned to celebrate my achievements without needing their validation, and to handle setbacks without their criticism. For the first time in my adult life, my self-worth wasn't tied to their approval or disapproval. I stopped checking my old email account for apologies that never came, and started focusing on the relationships with people who'd never asked me to prove I was worth their time and attention. The family that had kicked me out for a crime I hadn't committed was dead to me, just like I'd apparently been dead to them. I decided they were dead to me, just like I was to them. 3 years and 2 months after my family had destroyed my life over a false theft accusation, I received an email that would change everything. Not from my parents, but from my former coworker Jake, who'd kept in touch and still lived in my old neighborhood. His message was short and devastating. "Dude, you need to know that your sister's engagement ring was just found in your parents' garbage disposal. The plumber pulled it out during their kitchen renovation yesterday. Thought you should hear it from a friend." The discovery had happened exactly as Jake described. My parents had hired contractors to renovate their kitchen, and when the plumber disconnected the old garbage disposal unit to install a new one, he'd found an $8,000 diamond ring wedged inside the grinding mechanism. The same ring that had supposedly been stolen from Gemma's dresser 3 years earlier had been sitting in their kitchen drain the entire time, exactly where it would have ended up if someone had accidentally washed it down the sink while cleaning up after dinner. The ring had been in their garbage disposal for 3 years. Within hours of the discovery, my old email account was flooded with messages from every member of my family, each one more desperate than the last. My father's first email was a masterpiece of deflection. "Son, we need to talk immediately. There's been a terrible misunderstanding about Gemma's ring, and we need to discuss how to move forward as a family. No apology for destroying my life. No acknowledgement that they'd falsely accused me of a crime. No admission that they'd failed to search their own house properly before exiling their son. Just a misunderstanding that needed to be managed, and a summons to discuss moving forward, as if the past 3 years of my life could be erased with a family meeting." Gemma's text messages were even more revealing. "Elliot, I know you probably hate me right now, but we found my ring and I feel terrible about what happened. Can we please talk? I never meant for things to go this far." It's the phrase "go this far" was particularly rich, as if accusing me of theft and watching our parents kick me out had been some kind of minor miscommunication rather than a deliberate character assassination. Their emails and texts proved they knew they'd destroyed me. But the most damning evidence wasn't what they said. It was what they'd discovered about how the ring had actually gone missing. According to Jake's follow-up messages, the family had pieced together that Gemma had been wearing the ring while helping clean up after dinner the night before it disappeared from her dresser. She'd taken it off to wash dishes, placed it on the counter near the sink, and it had somehow fallen down the drain while she was cleaning. The detail that made my blood boil was learning that she'd known there was a possibility she'd lost it in the kitchen, but had never mentioned this during the frantic search or the family trial that followed. She'd allowed them to tear apart my character rather than admit she might have made a careless mistake that would make her look irresponsible with her precious engagement ring. For 3 years, my family had lived with the knowledge that they'd exiled me over an accusation they'd never properly investigated, while I'd been building a new life based on the assumption that they'd found evidence of my guilt. The ring had been in the most obvious place possible, the kitchen where she'd been working the night before, but they'd barely searched that area because it would have meant admitting their golden child might have been careless. Gemma had lost her own ring and blamed me for it. The documentation I'd been unconsciously building over 3 years of exile became the evidence of exactly what their false accusations had cost me. Every therapy session I'd paid for to process the trauma of being abandoned by my family, Every job opportunity I'd missed because of the instability they'd caused every holiday I'd spent alone, because they'd chosen to believe I was a thief. All of it was documented in bank statements, therapy bills, and calendar entries that told the story of a man rebuilding his life from nothing. The apartment leases showing my progression from a studio to a one-bedroom as I'd earned promotions and raises without their support. The therapy receipts totaling thousands of dollars spent processing the betrayal of people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The documentation of missed family events, birthday cards never sent, and phone calls that had never come, while they'd celebrated holidays and milestones without their criminal son. I had receipts for 3 years of damage they'd caused. After 3 years of building a life without them, the last thing I'd expected was to hold all the power in my relationship with the family that had abandoned me. But that's exactly where I found myself as their desperate emails and voicemails piled up in my inbox. Dad's messages evolved from demanding immediate contact to pleading for just 5 minutes to explain, while Gemma's texts went from casual apology attempts to increasingly frantic promises that she'd do anything to make this right. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family who'd given me 24 hours to confess to a crime I hadn't committed was now begging for my time and attention on my terms. They'd discovered that exile works both ways. Just as they'd cut me off for being an inconvenient truth-teller, I could cut them off for being proven liars who destroyed their son to protect their daughter's reputation. After 2 weeks of ignoring their increasingly desperate communication, I decided to respond to Dad's latest email with terms that would protect my hard-won independence while satisfying my curiosity about what they thought they could possibly say to justify 3 years of abandonment. My response was brief and non-negotiable. Coffee shop on Main Street in Millfield. 1 hour. Next Saturday at 2 p.m. Come alone, or don't come at all. They wanted to make things right, but I wasn't sure they could. The strategy I developed for our confrontation was designed to maintain the emotional boundaries that had taken me 3 years to build, while documenting their accountability for the damage they'd caused. I would meet them in public in the town where I'd built my new life on my schedule, and according to my rules. No family home where they held sentimental authority. No extended time where they could wear down my defenses with guilt and manipulation. I'd prepared a folder containing printed emails, therapy receipts, and a timeline of every milestone they'd missed while I was supposedly their criminal son. Not because I needed their acknowledgement to validate my experience, but because I wanted them to see exactly what their false accusations had cost in concrete, undeniable terms. The meeting would have a time limit, specific topics, and clear expectations about what kind of relationship might be possible moving forward. They'd forfeited the right to unconditional forgiveness when they'd chosen to believe Gemma's accusations without investigation, and any future contact would be earned through genuine accountability rather than demanded through family obligation. I would set boundaries they'd never respected before. The decision that had taken me the longest to reach wasn't whether to see them. It was whether I wanted any relationship with people who'd proven they'd sacrifice me to protect their golden child's image. 3 years of therapy and personal growth had taught me that forgiveness was a process, not a destination, and that I didn't owe anyone reconciliation just because we shared DNA. The question wasn't whether they deserved my forgiveness. It was whether I deserved the peace of mind that came from closing this chapter definitively, rather than spending the rest of my life wondering what they might have said if given the chance. Their guilt was their problem to solve, but my healing required knowing that I'd handled their betrayal with more integrity than they'd shown when they'd destroyed my life. I had to choose between their guilt and my peace. The coffee shop in Millfield where I'd chosen to meet my family was deliberately neutral territory, a small local place where I was a regular customer, but they'd never been giving me the psychological advantage of familiarity while forcing them to enter my world rather than expecting me to return to theirs. I arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a corner table with clear sight lines to the door, positioning myself where I could control the conversation's flow and exit timing. When Dad, Mom, and Gemma walked through the door at exactly 2 o'clock, they looked nothing like the confident family unit that had exiled me 3 years earlier. Dad's shoulders were slumped with guilt. Mom kept fidgeting with her purse, like she was nervous about facing judgment, and Gemma's eyes were red from what appeared to be recent crying. The power dynamic had completely reversed. I was the calm, collected person, waiting to hear what they had to say, while they were the desperate supplicants hoping for forgiveness they hadn't earned. The contrast with our last family meeting was striking. 3 years ago, I'd been the one standing in their living room begging them to believe my innocence, while they sat in judgment. Now they were approaching my table with the uncertainty of people who knew they'd been proven catastrophically wrong and weren't sure what consequences awaited them. They looked like defendants waiting for their sentence. Dad's opening speech was clearly prepared and rehearsed, delivered with the careful precision of someone who'd practiced in the mirror, but couldn't quite hide his desperation. "Son, we owe you the biggest apology of our lives. We made a terrible mistake based on incomplete information, and we've spent 3 years regretting how we handled the situation with Gemma's ring." The word choice was telling. Incomplete information, rather than false accusations. Mistake, rather than betrayal. And how we handled the situation, rather than destroying your life. Even in their apology, they were minimizing their actions and focusing on their own emotional comfort, rather than the damage they'd caused. Gemma's contribution was even more self-centered. "I feel so guilty about what happened, Elliot. I've been having anxiety attacks thinking about how you must hate us. I never meant for you to get hurt like this. I just want our family back together so we can all move past this and be happy again." The entire apology was structured around their feelings, their guilt, their desire for resolution. Not once did they acknowledge that I might have built a life without them, that I was happy with, or that their need for forgiveness might be less important than my need for boundaries. They wanted me back in their lives, to relieve their guilt, not because they'd genuinely recognized my worth as a person. Their apologies were still all about what they needed. When it was my turn to speak, I pulled out the folder I'd prepared and methodically walked them through the documented evidence of what 3 years of exile had cost me. The therapy receipts totaling $4,000 for sessions focused on processing family abandonment and rebuilding self-worth. The apartment leases showing how I'd progressed from a studio to a 1-bedroom, as I'd built my career without their support. The calendar entries marking every birthday holiday and family milestone I'd missed while they celebrated without their supposedly criminal son. This is what falsely accusing me of theft actually cost, I said, spreading the papers across the coffee shop table, while other customers glanced over at our obviously intense family meeting. $4,000 in therapy to process being abandoned by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. 3 years of rebuilding my entire sense of self-worth after you decided I was a thief without any evidence. Mom started crying when she saw the therapy bills, but I continued without acknowledging her tears. Every promotion I earned, every success I achieved, every moment of happiness I built, all of it happened while you were living comfortably with the decision to exile me rather than search your own house properly. The evidence wasn't just about money. It was about the relationships I'd missed, the family support I'd never received, and the trust that had been shattered when they'd chosen to believe the worst about me. I showed them text message screenshots from friends asking why I never talked about my family emails, from my employer's HR department offering employee assistance during what they'd assumed was a family crisis, and documentation of every major life event I'd navigated alone. I showed them exactly what 3 years of exile had cost. The moment that defined our entire future relationship came when Dad asked what he clearly thought was a reasonable question. What do we need to do to fix this and get our family back to normal? The assumption that normal was something I wanted to return to told me everything I needed to know about how little they'd learned from discovering their mistake. They still believed that family relationships were obligations rather than privileges that had to be earned through consistent love and respect. "There is no going back to normal," I replied calmly, watching their faces fall as they realized this wasn't going to be the tearful reunion they'd envisioned. You don't get to destroy someone's life and then demand forgiveness on your timeline because you feel guilty about what you did. And the terms I offered were non-negotiable, limited contact through email, only. No family gatherings or holidays. No expectation that I would participate in their version of family relationships, and absolute respect for my boundaries, without guilt trips or manipulation. They could earn a conditional relationship through consistent accountability and respect for my autonomy, but they would never again have the power to make me feel like I needed their approval to be worthy of love. I set boundaries. They'd have to respect or lose me forever. The weeks that followed our coffee shop confrontation revealed exactly how much my family had learned from discovering their catastrophic mistake in falsely accusing me of theft. Dad's initial emails were filled with resistance to my boundaries, arguing that family should be able to work through anything, and that I was being unnecessarily harsh by refusing to return to normal family dinners and holiday celebrations. Mom tried a different approach, sending long messages about how much they missed me and how empty the house felt without their son, as if their emotional discomfort was my responsibility to fix rather than a natural consequence of their decision to exile me. Gemma's texts alternated between guilt trips about how my absence was affecting family gatherings and promises that she'd learned her lesson about making accusations without evidence. But gradually, something shifted in their communication. The desperate pleading gave way to grudging acceptance that I was serious about my terms and wouldn't be manipulated back into the dysfunctional dynamic we'd had before. Dad stopped arguing about my boundaries and started asking permission before calling. Mom began respecting my request for email-only contact instead of showing up unannounced at my workplace. Gemma learned to accept that our relationship would be cordial, but distant, built on respect rather than the sibling closeness she'd forfeited when she'd watched them destroy my life. They finally had to accept the relationship I was willing to give. 6 months after our confrontation, I was living exactly the life I'd built during my exile, but with the added satisfaction of knowing that my family's guilt was their problem to manage rather than my burden to carry. The studio apartment had become a one-bedroom. In a better neighborhood, the warehouse job had evolved into a supervisor position, and the friendships I'd cultivated were based on mutual respect rather than blood obligation. My therapy sessions shifted from processing abandonment trauma to celebrating the strength I'd discovered in setting boundaries with people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my emotional well-being. The occasional email exchanges with my parents were polite, but limited, focused on practical updates, rather than the deep emotional connection they kept hoping would magically return. The most important lesson I'd learned wasn't about forgiveness or family reconciliation. It was about recognizing that some people forfeit the right to hurt you when they prove they'll sacrifice your well-being for their own comfort. My parents and Gemma would always be the people who'd falsely accused me of theft and chosen exile over investigation, but they were no longer the people whose approval I needed to feel worthy of love and respect. I still received holiday cards and birthday emails, but I no longer felt obligated to respond with gratitude for the bare minimum of acknowledgement. They'd learned to live with the natural consequences of their actions, and I'd learned to live without the family drama that had defined my first 26 years. I learned that family has to earn the right to hurt you.